It's not standing room only, so it's not too formal. Don't worry about that. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program, Journeys Towards Servingness, Enacting Change at Hispanic Serving Institutions. My name is Christopher Jones, and I serve as the Senior Diversity and Inclusion Officer here at the University of Redlands. Tonight's event is the culmination of our week-long series of events with our 2024 Diversity in Action resident, Dr. Marcela Cuellar. Diversity in Action is one of the series of initiatives announced in June of 2020 as part of the commitment of the President's Cabinet to improving diversity, equity, and inclusion at the University of Redlands. Diversity in Action is a week-long residency that is intended to introduce and engage various voices and perspectives across the university community and beyond. The events this week would not be possible without the support of the university community, and I want to say thank you to everyone who has had a part in the planning and hosting of this week's events. In particular, I want to express my deep appreciation to the efforts of our faculty, staff, and students who played a part in the execution of this year's Diversity in Action residency. Now, we have been fortunate this week to have a unique confluence of residencies here at the university. We have also had Melanie Demore, a singer, composer, choral conductor, music director, and three-time Grammy-nominated artist from Oakland, California, to be in community with us. Ms. Demore describes herself as a vocal activist and has been working with our students in the Conservatory of Music all week. We've had the opportunity to have Ms. Demore and Dr. Cuellar together for some joint events this week, and I appreciate the partnership with Dr. Nicole Andrews to make the collaboration happen. In just a few moments, I will step aside from the stage for a musical selection from Ms. Demore. But first, I have the pleasure of introducing President Krista Newkirk, the 12th President of the University of Redlands. Now in her 4th academic year at the University of Redlands, President Newkirk continues to enhance the Redlands experience. Under her leadership, the University of Redlands continues to grow its footprint throughout California, solidifying a successful merger with San Francisco-based Presidio Graduate School, which will become a signature part of the university's School of Business and Society, a successful acquisition of Los Angeles-based Woodbury University. She led the development of a new student-focused strategic plan and continues to build upon the university's designation as a Hispanic-serving institution. This dedication led to the university's recognition by the U.S. Department of State as a Fulbright Hispanic-serving institution leader, one of only 5 master's universities in California to receive such recognition. In response to the evolving needs of today's students, President Newkirk facilitated the development of market-responsive programs, and she continues to advance the affordability and accessibility through the Redlands Promise campaign. She serves on several national education boards and frequently presents at conferences nationwide on the dynamic evolution of higher education. President Newkirk.
All right, well, good evening. Unfortunately, you got the long bio, so my apologies for that, but good evening, everyone. It's so wonderful to have you here and to have you joining our community as we hear from our Director in Action, our Diversity in Action resident, Dr. Marcela Cuellar. We are incredibly fortunate to have her here with us tonight, and I'm looking forward to her inspiring presentation, as I know you are. Now, before we get to Dr. Cuellar's impressive bio, I want to take a few moments to highlight the significance of our Diversity in Action residency. As Dr. Jones mentioned, since 2022, this program has been a cornerstone of our ongoing commitment to fostering a more inclusive campus environment. This program was created to bring thought leaders and innovators to our campus who can challenge our perspectives, expand our understanding of diversity and inclusion, and inspire meaningful action. Through these visits, we not only engage in vital conversations, but we also strengthen our collective efforts toward creating a community where everyone feels valued, heard, and empowered to contribute. It's also particularly fitting that we have Dr. Cuellar here with us during Hispanic Heritage Month, a time to celebrate the rich cultural and historical contributions of the Hispanic and Latino communities. This month serves as an opportunity to reflect on the way these communities have shaped our nation and continue to inspire our campus community. Now, as many of you know, the University of Redlands is designated as a Hispanic Serving Institution, or HSI. It's a designation we take great pride in as it signifies our commitment to supporting the success of our Hispanic and Latino communities. As we continue to embrace this responsibility, I am honored to introduce someone whose work directly aligns with our mission to support our diverse university community. Dr. Marcela Cuellar is an associate professor and chancellor's fellow in the School of Education at the University of California, Davis. Her research examines Latinx student experiences and outcomes at Hispanic serving institutions, emerging HSIs, campus climate, and community college baccalaureates. In 2022, she received the American Education Research Association's Post-Secondary Award from the Latinx Research Issues Special Interest Group, given her significant contributions to educational outreach. She is currently collaborating on several multi-campus projects related to educational equity and innovation. These include Hispanic serving research institutions, community college bachelor degree programs, and the HSI Research Colectiva, a multi-generational community of HSI researchers focused on generating and sharing research to inform policy decisions and improve practices. Dr. Cuellar's commitment to higher education access and equity is deeply rooted in her personal and professional trajectory. Born and raised in Oxnard, California, she is the proud daughter of Mexican immigrants and the youngest of 6 children. She attended Stanford University, earning a bachelor's degree in psychology and Spanish. Her undergraduate experience inspired her to ensure more first-generation and low-income students had the opportunity to pursue a college education. She works in educational outreach in the Bay Area and was an Upward Bound counselor in San Diego. She earned a master's degree in higher education leadership from the University of San Diego and a PhD in higher education and organizational change from UCLA. Dr. Cuellar's work, particularly her research and advocacy for equity in higher education, perfectly aligns with the goals of our HSI designation. She has dedicated her career to advancing the success of underrepresented students, and her insights are invaluable to any institution committed to promoting access and equity. But I get the added pleasure of welcoming not Dr. Cuellar next, although now you have her bio, but Melanie DeMore, who will be joining us and leading us in song this evening. And if you've never had the opportunity to hear Melanie DeMore and to participate with her, you are in for a real treat. Melanie, would you please join us?
I'm actually just going to sing one for you, but please come to the concert tomorrow night and you'll get to do all kinds of things. And it's been a pleasure being in the same place with you, my sister. You're in for a treat. She's wonderful. When the day breaks, when the sun goes down, I can hear the song of the wind. When the sun goes down, and I pray for peace, and I look to the light. When the sun goes down, I pray
It is on. All right. Good evening, everybody. And I just want to thank Melanie for such a beautiful, beautiful just introduction to our conversation today. One of the things when we were talking about what kind of tone would be great for a song to introduce, I asked if it could be something about hope, about the future. And so really listening to this idea of light and peace is really perfect for what I hope some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So as you heard from my introduction, a lot of my work has focused looking at Hispanic serving institutions as well as emerging HSIs. And I like to think about these institutions really as how do we think about change within these institutions? And so that's what a lot of my conversation will be with you today. But before I get started on the formal part of my presentation, I just want to say thank you to President Newkirk for the just welcomingness of this Diversity in Action residency, Dr. Jones for all of your hospitality and really setting up an incredible week, being able to engage with faculty and staff as well as students. And also, I just want to mention thank you to Professor Adriana Alvarado in the School of Education, who really was instrumental in the invitation to be here with you all today, and just a wonderful champion of equity, social justice, and change in higher education, and one of my inspirations for a lot of this work. So today I'm going to talk about this idea of journeys towards servingness, and how do we enact change or think about enacting change at Hispanic serving institutions. And this is, for me, as you heard from my bio, really rooted in my own personal commitments as well as some of my professional journey into higher education, and now working in an institution that's an emerging HSI. It's really now just become part of the work that I have to think about on the day-to-day about what that means for my own work within my own institution, and then of course working with other colleges, universities as they're thinking about their trajectories. And it's really become clear that we're talking about a journey. It's not something that's gonna happen overnight. This is an evolution and a real invitation for us to think about how we might do things differently with this identity as an HSI. So what are we talking about when we talk about HSI? So I want to lay kind of that national context to begin with. There are 600 HSIs across the United States. This is 1 in 5 colleges and universities across the United States and Puerto Rico are now HSIs. So 20% of all colleges and universities. And this number will continue to grow because among emerging HSIs, there's about 350. So fast forward in another 2 to 5 years, it's going to be an even larger share of institutions that will be thinking about this question, what does it mean to be a Hispanic serving institution? Now, when we look at those institutions that are HSIs, and I guess it's important first to define, well, what does an HSI mean for those who may not be as familiar with that? It's a designation that's based on an enrollment. And this is a federal designation of federal policy that decided this in 1992 through advocacy efforts from Latino leaders, presidents across the southern border, really advocating for greater resource equity for institutions that were educating a large proportion of historically underserved students but didn't have access to the same financial resources as some of their counterparts. And so with this federal designation, we have seen more institutions meeting this threshold. Once they meet this threshold, they are eligible for competitive federal funding to create programs to better support their students and really develop infrastructure and capacity building to support Latinx students as well as the various students that attend HSIs. When we look at who are these HSIs, who are these 600 HSIs, we see the breakdown here. We have about a third are private not-for-profit institutions, very much like the University of Redlands, and the majority are public institutions across the United States. We also see that the majority are now four-year institutions. Many people think that many of them are community colleges, and that used to be true about 10 years ago, but that changed as we see more Latina undergraduates enrolling in higher education. They're now entering four-year institutions, and so this is a larger share. Now, when we look at who attends HSIs, it's not a surprise that given the designation, that a large proportion are Hispanic or Latino. But we also see that HSIs serve many other students from other racial ethnic groups. And so that begs the question to ask, what does Hispanic serving mean, right? Given this context of a racially diverse student population. And that invites a lot of questions about how we can think about this differently, and something that we'll chat about throughout my presentation today. Now, what is this? This is the national landscape. But what does that landscape look like in California? So we have data that we can pull to understand that context. When we look at California, when we look historically at HSIs, we see that we represent a lot of the HSIs across the United States. From the moment that this information was starting to be tracked in 1994, we had 40 HSIs, which at that time there were only about 190, to now out of the 600, we account for 172. That's almost a third of all the HSIs in the United States are in California. Now, we know that California's system of higher education is very unique with our large public sector as well as our large private sector. And so we now have started to look at this data. Well, what does this look like for our respective public systems of higher ed as well as our independent colleges and universities? And what we see here is that when we look at the University of California system, 50% of the undergraduate campuses are now HSIs. The other 4 campuses will be HSIs in another 5 years. That's a guarantee. And they're actively thinking about that question. When we look at our CSUs, 21 of the 23 are now HSI, so that's 91% of the entire CSU system is comprised of HSIs, and the same pattern goes. Give it another few years, those other 2 will also be HSIs in the near future. When we look at the community colleges, they've often been well represented in the HSI sector, and they are currently 91% of all of the community colleges in the state are HSIs. Now, when we look at the private colleges and universities, 40% of the 85 independent colleges and universities in California are already HSI designated, and 30% approximately are what we call emerging HSIs, meaning that they currently enroll that 15 to 24% Latinx undergraduate students, and in the next few years, they will also hit that 25% designation. So this is a significant proportion of all of our systems of higher education in California, and by all intents and purposes, this means that our state is now a state of Hispanic serving institutions. And I think that this really begs a question of, well, what can that mean? What does Hispanic serving mean? When we have these many institutions engaging with this question of, well, what does this mean for how we educate the students that we enroll today? And that's where we will go with our conversation for the rest of this evening. One of the things that I want to mention as well with the private colleges and universities is that they educate 21% of all the undergraduates in California and 55% of all the graduate students in California. So they play an outsized role in what our system of higher education in California does. And so it also invites opportunities for us to reimagine what education can look like. And that's really how I think of HSI. We have the federal definition, which is that enrollment criteria, but with this sector of higher ed in California, or these sectors in California now really being systems of HSI, it really is an invitation to think of HSI as a way to reimagine how we might think of higher education. And more recently, I've started to say it's not just an invitation, but it's really a charge as to think about how we can do things differently. And so I really appreciate President Newkirk's mention of this responsibility that this idea of HSI brings into our forefront. Now, what does it mean to be serving students beyond this idea of this federal construct? And here I want to turn to this notion of HSIs as a journey, or servingness as a journey, which really is defined as the intentionality to serve students, Latinx students, under this guise or identity of being an HSI. And I want to here put a plug for Dr. Gina Garcia, who is the leading scholar in a lot of the HSI work and is really shaping the field for us to think about what does it mean to intentionally serve. And she has a podcast where she interviews different HSI leaders, whether they be researchers, practitioners, to talk about what it means to be HSIs and how are they trying to enact change under this identity. Now, I was fortunate to be one of her guests in season 2 to talk a little bit about some of my own research and my own work and how I think about HSIs. But I want to point out to a question that she asks every guest. And it's the second question that she asks every guest when you listen to her podcast. And I think it's a critical question for each of us to ask ourselves as we're thinking about this HSI work. She asks everyone to say or reflect on, describe your servingness journey. How did HSIs come to your consciousness? And I like to think in terms of metaphors. And so a few years ago, I had an opportunity to go to CSU Channel Islands to do a presentation on HSIs. And I had just done the podcast recording. And so I was trying to think of metaphors. And the metaphor that came to my mind was this visual here. This is the Conejo grade, which is when you're driving up from Ventura County, where Oxnard is, to Los Angeles County, or driving south, you come across this grade. And as I was thinking about this grade that I used to drive very often throughout my life, going to Los Angeles, I thought, this is an outstanding metaphor for what it means to do servingness. And what I mean by that is that in this grade, you have this path, but it's not linear. It's very curvy, it's very windy, as you can see. And you can't even see the top of it, right? You can't see your destination, but you're going on this road. It's windy, you're figuring out, you're feeling your way through it. And because it has such a steep grade, you have to shift gears in order for you to get to the top. And so sometimes when you're shifting gears, and I've had this happen, I maybe didn't have the newest car, and so sometimes that meant my car was moving slower and I was slowing down traffic. Or sometimes somebody else was doing that. And so when I think about us engaging in this notion of thinking about servingness, we're all trying to think about how do we get to this destination of creating an institution that is more intentional for the students that we serve today, but there's not a linear path to that. We all have to kind of shift our gears at times to figure out how do we get to that destination. And I think about this work very much so also within our institutions, that it mimics this pattern of kind of having a sense of where we're going, but it's not always clear to us. And sometimes we're gonna stall. And sometimes it's gonna take us shifting our gears a little bit more in order to reach the top or to whatever that destination is as we're going on this winding journey. But that journey is also an exciting journey, right? To try something different. And so I want to just share here a little bit about how my own consciousness about HSIs began and how it continues to evolve as we learn more and especially learn through different challenges that might emerge. And so for me, I have to reflect on that I did not attend an HSI. That is not an experience that I understand that our students have today. And I think that's an important thing to remember is that many of us probably did not attend an HSI. So we are being tasked to imagine a different type of an education than most of us experienced. And I think that's exciting, but I did attend a private institution, like many of the undergraduates here today. And what did I experience in that private environment? I experienced a lot of culture shock, big difference from my own home community. I also experienced a lot of challenges, But I also experienced a lot of transformation and a lot of transformative learning in that space. And I can imagine that many of your students here today have some of those similar experiences when they're first-gen, low-income, and students of color. So for me, that idea of thinking about how do we create an education that is more responsive to our students today, it's personal, right? It's thinking about, well, what kind of education may have been even more beneficial to students like me, and how can I think about that differently? Now, professionally, I am thinking about it very much in the classroom. What does it mean for me as a professor to engage in serving this? Because a lot of my work with HSIs really has been through research and learning about HSIs through the lens of students, who is one of the main places that I started to learn more about HSIs and really try to reimagine what possibilities there are with transformation at HSIs. So I just want to mention here that one of my first professional entrees working at an HSI was when I taught a first-year experience class at CSU Channel Islands, which was an HSI, is an HSI, and this was one of their first HSI grants. And so I had an opportunity there to really think about, well, what does HSI mean in this context? And what I really was inspired by was on day one when I asked the students, what brings you here? Why are you in higher education? And their answers were just really inspirational. Some are not surprising. They talk about career preparation. They talk about their professional goals. They talk about being change agents. But they also talked about breaking patterns. And what they meant by that was, how do we break socioeconomic patterns of poverty? How do we break patterns of limited social mobility into certain positions of influence? And so that was really, for me, important to think about, how do we understand who our students are within HSIs, and how do we provide them the kind of education that they desire? I continue to do this kind of activity particularly in my undergraduate classes. And here's in spring 2015 when I asked the same question to students at one of my first classes at UC Davis. And it's the same pattern. They understand that what they want to do is they want to create change. They want to get better jobs. They want to give back to their communities. And so that same desire of saying, we want an education that's going to provide us with these opportunities, continued to elevate my consciousness about HSI is more than just closing equity gaps. It is about that, and it's also about ensuring that we're providing students with an education that's going to allow them to achieve these dreams and aspirations that they have. Now, more recently, I've had the opportunity to begin to think about it at the graduate level. So I mentioned that 55% of all graduate degrees in California are provided by private institutions, but we don't know a whole lot about what it means to engage in serving this in the graduate sector. And I had the opportunity last year to teach a graduate seminar about HSIs, and our graduate students in that course emphasized that. How do we serve students at the graduate level too? Because we're part of this conversation as well, even if the designation doesn't include them in the definition, but they're also part of these communities. And so that continues to evolve a lot of my thinking about serving this. It keeps building, it keeps expanding, and I think that all of us really could benefit from kind of thinking about how our thinking about serving this really is a journey, right? It's as we learn more and learn about the places that we can impact change, then how can we go about impacting change and changing things so that they are more responsive to our students today? Now here, I will mention that we have a lot of research that has started to try to unpack what does serving this mean on a broader scale. And we have fortunately had a lot of different frameworks that begin to guide us or give us ideas about how do we take that journey into action. And so here, I hope many of you are familiar with this framework, but this was a framework that was developed in 2019 by Dr. Garcia, Dr. Anne-Marie Nunez, and Dr. Vanessa Sanson, who are all leading scholars in the space about HSIs. And what they did is that they took stock of all the research that had been produced on HSIs up to that point, and they asked the question, how are researchers defining servingness, that intentionality of how we serve Latinx students at HSIs and the various students that are at HSIs? And what they distilled was that it really comes down to many things, many dimensions. So when we're talking about HSIs and servingness, we do have to think about, well, what is it that we're talking about? How are we thinking about changing different elements of an institution? Now, one of the things that they really highlight is that HSIs can be hindered or helped by various things external to the institution. So what they can do is going to be impacted by federal policy, by state policy, by the various local policies that may influence what's possible for them to do or not, as well as the community members that are part of that institution outside. That includes board members, that includes alumni. Those are forces that can shape what HSIs do. Now, within an HSI, we have what we call these structures for serving. Different ways that we might think about how are we serving students. And some of those include, does our mission and values talk about HSIs? Does our HSI grants, if we have any, are they intentionally thinking about Latina students? And how are we using those resources to think differently about how we are doing the work in order to achieve more equity? Are we changing the curriculum? How culturally relevant is that curriculum? As well as the composition of the faculty and staff. Does it align or does it reflect the composition of the students? And these are all different elements of an institution. So it helps to give us language to say, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about certain structures of serving? And which ones are the ones that we can adapt or modify at any point in time? Now, what they also talk about is the experiences that students have in colleges and universities. And this is where I've focused a lot of my work, is really trying to understand from the student perspective, what are they experiencing at HSIs? And the research has told us that a lot of students are validated in these spaces. They find affirming experiences within the classroom or with their peers. At the same time, we find that students also talk about the ways that they continue to experience discrimination or the ways that they are microaggressed. And that begs the question of, well, is that serving if we are still having students encounter these forms of discrimination? And most of us will say, no, that's not. Those are places that we can improve and advance. Now, the researchers have also talked a lot about outcomes. Well, which outcomes are we talking about? Academic outcomes we know matter tremendously. So have we reduced equity gaps when it comes to graduation rates, when it comes to retention in STEM programs? How about labor outcomes? Have we removed inequities? But what we also say is that there's more to an education. And so a lot of the researchers have also said we need to think about non-academic outcomes. I don't particularly care for the word non-academic. I think it's really more like metacognitive or something bigger, right? Holistic outcomes, empowering outcomes, or as Dr. Garcia calls them, liberatory outcomes. And some of those can include social agency, the notion that students often come to college with that desire to create change in society. Are we studying that? Are really thinking about how do we enhance that in students? Or are we thinking about their civic engagement and involvement? And when I look at these non-academic outcomes, to me, this seems that this aligns very much with the mission of Redlands, as I understand it, of developing students who want to create meaningful impact, live lives of joy. all of those would fall in this notion of non-academic outcomes, but essential to a holistic, personalized education. So what this framework does, it gives us language to orient us to what section are we doing or trying to change in an effort to be more intentional with the students that we are working with. It requires us to be equity-minded, right? To think about not placing responsibility on students and blaming them for inequities in their outcomes, but really saying, what can the institution do to recognize that there's been these systemic forms of oppression and students are not to blame for that? What can we do to change and make this environment more welcoming to students and more empowering? And what this also helps, in its totality, it seems like a lot, right? If we think about all of the dimensions. But when we think about who are our leaders, educators in colleges and universities, for me, I like to think about we all play a role in one part of this, right? So we all have a sphere of influence, a place where we can impact change. So it also helps us think about, well, which is the area that I can influence directly? And how can I think or use this notion of HSI or under this notion of serving this to influence and change practice towards more equity? Now, when we think about why does this matter, why does this notion of equity-oriented thinking and change matter within HSIs, what we've started to learn from a lot of the research on HSIs is that while these institutions may be more compositionally diverse, the salience of race and racism continues at HSIs. We see that too often the curriculum does not change. It continues to be very Eurocentric. And if there is ethnic studies, it tends to be marginalized. So that raises a question of how can we make that knowledge more integrated for students, because that likely will lead to greater success. We also see that in much of the funding or some of the funding for HSIs, there tends to be race evasiveness, or as some scholars call it, Latinx ghosting, meaning that Latinx students are not mentioned at all in the kinds of programming or targeted support that comes from this funding, but yet this funding is based on an enrollment designation that is based on Latinx students. So at a minimum, we should be thinking about what works for Latinx undergraduates. We also find that institutions that have larger shares of white students tend to be the ones who get the funding. It's usually probably tied to resources, right, that they may already have that advantage them in those competitive grant processes. We also know, and a lot of the more recent work has started to really center the experiences of other historically marginalized students at HSIs, and we see that a lot of that research shows that anti-Blackness continues at HSIs, anti-Indigenous racism, as well as other forms of oppression. And so that begs the question, can we truly be serving if we are upholding systems of oppression for other groups? And we would like to say no. We should say no. That is not okay. So this really invites us to continue to think more deeply that just because you have more of a composition of students of color, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've changed structures or systems or policies. And so there's a lot of work that we still need to do. More recently, we've also started to think about intersectionality more. And we have, in 2023, Dr. Garcia and I were special editors for a special topic collection on ARA Open. And there's 8 different articles in this special topic collection that really centers intersectionality at HSIs. And what we learned from this work is consistent with what we know. Unfortunately, students continue to face marginalization on these campuses based on their intersecting identities. Women of color in STEM continue to face inequities in those spaces, as well as Indigenous students. And oftentimes those students take the responsibility on themselves to try to change those campus environments. And so that means that we're still putting that responsibility on students to do the work of equity. So how can we learn about how we can create environments that really are more supportive of students where they don't have to take that burden on? When we look at the structures of serving, we are also finding that a lot of campuses aren't always thinking, when they're developing some structures, really thinking about the specific needs of their communities. And here, for example, there's this wonderful article that talks about the ways that when internships are being developed at a particular HSI, it hasn't really accounted for the fact that some of the internships that were typically recommended to students necessarily didn't feel aligned with those internships. And so how might we think about the kinds of structures that we're supporting, that they're actually responsive and reflective of those communities that we are serving? We also have to think about it at hiring. Are we valuing those kinds of skill sets that indicate to us that faculty, staff, leadership are going to recognize that intentionality in serving? And then also that oftentimes that race evasiveness that we see in grant funding, oftentimes it comes from the federal government framing or state government framing in itself. So there are limitations at times, and so we have to be mindful of those as we think about the ways that different institutions might be able to engage in serving this. Now, one of the things, I'll skip this one here because it doesn't say a whole lot, and I really want to get to the part that to me is a little bit more exciting these days, which is really going back to this idea that students can often be the insight, right, to understand, are we meeting our HSI goals? Are we meeting our servingness goals? But that students themselves can be knowledge generators in that idea, and that they can also be change agents towards servingness, and that we can provide opportunities for them to work with us to define solutions. And here I just have a few pictures kind of highlighting this idea. Back in 2019, UC Davis had an HSI task force. And one of the things that we wanted to do, and I know that this is very much what happened here with the task force as well, is how do we garner student voice and input? One of my colleagues in our Chicano Studies department really wanted to think about different ways that we could gather insights onto those perspectives. So she had an art expression session where students could, through art, express how they felt the university could better serve them. And so here you see them expressing their art as a way to express how they felt the university was not serving them well, or how we need to think about serving this moving forward. I mentioned the graduate students that I've had an opportunity to work with, and they've really pushed our thinking to say, we need to think about how graduate students not only are how we're serving them, not just to serve our undergrads at times, but how are we just serving them and thinking about their professional development and growth intentionally. And so they're really guiding us. We've developed a graduate council now for our HSI advisory board so that graduate student voices are included in that as well. And most recently, a colleague of mine at UC Santa Cruz presented at a convening in April where she shared how she has transformed her course to engage student participatory action research within the classroom so that students are generating research projects that come back to share how is the university serving them or not, and that's really student-driven. So I think these start to give us ideas about how students are not just recipients of or beneficiaries of the services that we provide at HSIs, but how they can also very much inform what we can be doing moving forward. So with that, a few years ago, I had the opportunity to work with and learn from students at Sac State as an advisory board of a student photo voice project that two of their faculty were engaging in. Dr. Amber Gonzalez, who you see here in this picture, and her colleague, Dr. Kevin Ferreira Van Leer. developed a photo voice project entitled Using Our Voices to Transform HSIs. And what this type of work is it engages undergraduates to take photos on campus and come together to make sense of what does this mean? How is our campus serving us? But what it also does is it links administrators to listen to students with what they find and engage with their photo voice. So it really is a way to empower student voice in this conversation, and that led to a series of changes at Sac State based on this process that students engaged in. Now here, the Sacramento Bee, which is the local newspaper up in Sacramento, highlighted some of the contributions of this particular project, but it also highlighted places where Sacramento State was still falling short, meaning areas where they still had a lot of work to do. Faculty composition was one of those, really recognizing that there are still these tremendous gaps between faculty representation and the students that they're serving. But it really provided a great way to highlight how students can be part of the solution or can tell us about places where we can create change towards our journeys of serving this. And so I was so inspired by this particular project, which is a long, intensive project, and I thought, well, how can I learn from students, but in places that I have a little bit more influence directly? And so taking some ideas from this deep, important work, I said, what would students say on my campus if we did a photo elicitation project? And I had them reflect and write about what does serving this look like on campus. And as I mentioned, I teach a class to undergrads. And so I teach a unit on HSIs and also on APESIs, which are Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander institutions that have somewhat of a similar history to HSIs in that they're enrollment-based, and we're trying to really define what does serving this mean. And so our campus is an emerging HSI, but it's also an APESI. And so after this unit, I asked students to engage in an assignment where they have to go around campus and they have to answer or take pictures to this question. How does the university effectively serve students? How does it ineffectively serve students? They have to take 3 photographs or take observational notes, and then they have to write a short reflection explaining what does this mean and how does it tie directly to this idea of serving this. We tried this 2 years ago. I had no idea what we were going to get as a reflective process, but I was so impressed and I learned so much from the perspective of students that it's really become something that I like to share with people because it really provides these unique perspectives on what we might call structures of serving. So what did we find? Students took a lot of pictures of spaces. Not surprising, right? But students took pictures of our Student Community Center, which is a main center on campus that has a lot of our identity-based student support services. And they took pictures of it from different angles. They also took pictures of offices within that center. One of those was our undocumented student center. They were also very clear we are not going to take pictures of that center because we want to protect the students who are accessing that. So they were very conscious of their approaches to collecting data. They also wrote about our ethnic theme dorm that is called Casa Cuauhtémoc. And students also talked about a particular center that for us is only 7 years old, but really has become the hub of serving many of our Latinx undergraduates. And that's our Center for Chicanx and Latinx Student Success. And this is a space, which is this corner here with the bricks, and then the stairs leading up. And students said, that is a space of serving this because that's a one-stop shop for support and community. Students also highlighted places on campus where we recognize that we sit on indigenous land of the Patwin peoples, and that this is their ancestral land, and that is an indicator that we're raising consciousness for students. And then students showed our quad as well, said this is a really good space. Now, overall, we say these are great things, right? We've created these structures of serving even before we're in HSI, because I would say HSI is really about action, right? And serving the students that we have. So we don't have to wait till that designation. But what really struck me was that how some students may say this is a structure of serving, while other students said it may be serving, however, there's problems here. And I want to share some of the problems. Students mentioned the center for Chicanx, what we call El Centro. They said it's a great center, however, the only way you know to go up there is this small sign, that's that orange sign in the corner. If you're walking by, you may miss that sign. You don't know that you need to go upstairs. Why can't we paint that staircase to draw your attention to go upstairs, there's resources for you? Other students said, center's great. Look at where it's located though. It's on the second floor. For students who have mobility challenges, they have to take an elevator at the very back of the building in order to even get there. Have we thought about students' different needs? And so it really started to show it's more complex than just providing a structure. We have to keep thinking and interrogating how are we serving the needs of students with their various intersecting identities. And also, when we build a structure, do students necessarily know that it's there? So in our conversation when we were sharing this back with students, we had one transfer student raise his hand and he said, you know, it's really inspirational that the university's doing all of these things. It's really great. And then he said, I didn't know about any of this. He was just about to graduate. And I thought, well, is that serving? We've created it, but not all students know about it. Students also talked about programs on campus. They talked about events that intersected ethnic studies with education. They also talked about Avanza is our HSI initiative, what we've titled it. They said that's a way that we're indicating to the public that we're trying to work towards serving this. They also highlighted Clínica, which is a health clinic in a largely Latina community that connects students who are pre-med to providing services to the local community. That has been in existence since 1972. And so students were saying we do have a history in places where we have been engaging with serving this. And so I invite institutions to think about that. Where are the spaces that we already have been doing work, and we should highlight that a little bit more. We also saw the curriculum. Students said, oh, I see ethnic studies journals. These artworks that we see in the background, that's where our ethnic studies department is. And so they took pictures of different art and that art hall, and they said that is a space of serving this because we have ethnic studies curriculum. One student also highlighted a particular picture from their education class where they showed we're getting curriculum that really highlights different groups, and that shows us that faculty are being intentional about the curriculum that we're learning. What's clearly missing, though, in this picture about what happens in the classroom? Who's missing? Faculty. In the 2 years that we've done this, there's been 0 times that faculty have been mentioned. That concerns me, right? Because even if we don't have compositional representation, I would hope that students would at least talk about the pedagogies that they're experiencing on their college, in our campus, and this tells us, no, they don't really think about faculty in this equation. Now, we also have students talk about student organizations. Some of the student-run retention programs that have a deep history on the campus. But we also had students highlight some of the more recent student organizations that they've been developing. And to me, what strikes me about those pictures is the very 2 on the end. And it's the first Asian American sorority, and also our Asian Pacific Islander queer student group. And these are groups that are intersecting identities for students. And so I thought that was fascinating. They're really picking up on ways that we're addressing the intersectional needs of students, and students play a critical role in that. Now, the Servingness framework historically doesn't have student organizations on there, so how can we think about the ways that we support student organizations? We also have representation in art and food. Students highlighted that. When we go to the dining commons, we have access to food that we feel reflects us. We also have art in murals, and we are, these are featured in the Student Community Center, so they're centrally located and visible to students. We also had students in the middle there highlight that in the bookstore there's sashes that reflect their different groups that they might self-identify with, and they said that's serving because we are being seen, right, with the places that we want to celebrate our identities. Now, and then they also talked about different art events and performances on campus that really show that more diverse representation. But I want to bring you to these two pictures at the very end here, and I'm sorry that they might seem very small. But students talked about our pantry, and they said that is an indicator of servingness, right? We're thinking about students' basic needs. When we had a conversation about this on campus, a young student raised her hand, and she said, the pantry's great. However, I just want to point out that, you know, my family's from Central America, and we don't have black beans in the pantry. And that's something that really would make me feel like I'm being seen. And so that just really raised how even when we've created this servingness structure, sometimes we still have work to do. And this last year, this last picture shows in our dining commons these utensils that students use. And there's an empty one. That empty utensil holder is for chopsticks. Students said, why are there 3 fork containers that are fully full, and the one that's missing is our chopsticks, and it's just empty? What can we interpret from this? Is it that there's a high need for chopsticks? Are we just not refilling it? Why can't one of these fork ones become a chopstick container? And so we had this deep conversation about it, and I showed this to our Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs after we did this activity, and he said, we could change that easily. And so we thought, how is that something that's so small, but for students can be symbolic about, are we really thinking about their needs and what's being used? And some of those things could be free to change or relatively minor to change. So how might these kinds of like participatory student voice activities give us more insight about places where we might still have work to do, even when we're trying to engage in more work? Now, one common tension with colleges and universities is, well, if you're supporting Latina students, who are you not serving then? And so that's that tension, right? Or how do we make sure that we're serving all students? So this year we unfortunately made a mistake when we were doing this activity class assignment. And some students did the assignment without thinking of like HSI or Anapizi as like their guiding frame. So they said, I looked at servingness for all. And I didn't want to have them redo the work, so we said, okay, we'll go ahead and submit it. As long as you meet the criteria for the other elements, we'll definitely honor your assignment. And this is what they came up with. It's the Student Community Center, it's the pantry, and it's the Student Recruitment and Retention Center. Those are the same pictures that students were thinking about when they were thinking about it from a servingness lens. So for me, what this reinforces is that when we just create these structures to intentionally serve Latinx students, students of color, they're gonna serve all students. because we are just providing resources that are just really responsive to the students that are our students today. So as we think about our servingness journeys for each of our campuses, I think it's important for us to think about what are the different conversations that we need to be engaging to equip faculty, staff, leaders with the kinds of knowledge and questions for us to think about what can we transform in this next iteration of our institutions. And that is an evolving process, that we as individuals continue to be on our servingness journey, learning new things, trying new things, seeing what works, see what doesn't work, and continuing to ask questions. And that this happens both at the individual level, but also at the institutional level. And so I think as we continue to think about this work, we are talking about a journey of transforming spaces into what the needs of our students are today and what the needs are of the various players within our institutions. And so for me, as I hope for you, that provides a lot of hope and opportunity. It is hard work, but it's possible. And so with that, I just want to say thank you so much again for having me here today, and I look forward to any questions you may have or dialogue as we engage with each other. Thank you so much.
If you have questions, we would just ask that you please try and come to one of the mics so that way for the recording we can get your volume, okay? Any questions?
And thank you for sitting with me as well.
Thank you to President Newkirk for your support in this, to Dr. Alvarado, and thank you, Dr. Cuellar, for being here and sharing good information with us. I have a question about HSIs. How are HSIs adapting to meet the needs of the increasingly diverse student population? So how is HSI being an ally and extending that hand and support for African American students, or Palestinian students? And so that's my question.
Yeah, I think that thank you for that question. I think that when we're starting to really learn how anti-Blackness continues in HSIs, how anti-Indigenous sentiments, how homophobia still continues to prevail in a lot of our HSIs, it lets us know you can't be serving if you are marginalizing other folks. And so that importance of allyship is critical there. And I think also when we think about those outcomes, especially those non-academic outcomes, students want to change society. And that means that we need to be providing critical knowledge that helps them think about how can we create more equity moving forward. And oftentimes that means how can we be an allyship when we hold privileged identities, right? And while Latina students may be racialized in many ways, there are also some places where they hold privileged identities. And so are we thinking about that critically and elevating folks' critical consciousness to say, we have to be in solidarity. Oftentimes, we continuously hear that the challenge is, how do we make sure that as we are supporting Latina students, that we're not marginalizing others? And I think that we really have to emphasize that serving this is not a zero-sum game. That if we center race consciousness equity, it is going to benefit everyone to be better change agents, right, in society. And how does that align with our mission? I think that's important for us to think about. How do these ideas align with the very missions we hold dear and true about our institutions? Because that'll look slightly different for every institution, but I think that helps anchor the work in a deeper level. So I hope that starts to answer a little bit of your question.
Cuellar. Thank you so much for being here. It is such an honor to have you here. Redlands, I know we met earlier, and I cited you 6 different times in my dissertation, so just to be able to talk to you is fantastic. And there's other EDD students here right now, which I'm sure you are inspiring. My question for you is, I work in advancement, and I was an EDD graduate. How can we start to build a grant writing culture here to support Latinx students? We do have our Department of Education grant, but how can we nurture that kind of environment?
That is a great question. So I think there's a couple things that come to mind, and I think it's great that as I've learned about your Title V grant, that it's intentional, right? You've done work to really think deeply about what does it mean to serve our particular students, to help them advance in their success and close those equity gaps that exist on the campus. And so I think that one of the things that is important here is there's many other buckets of funding through the federal government, right? So how do we ensure when those resources are being sought that that same intentionality is being given to those different areas? I worry about that at times as we have more institutions being competitive for these resources. How are we thinking about who is trying to secure that funding? And are we making sure that that those individuals pursuing those grants have a sense of what the strategic goals are for the institution with their HSI, with their particular HSI goals? So how can we train faculty or staff who are pursuing those so that they are aligning to those goals? I think we need to do that more. I also think that there is opportunities here to think about different funding sources moving forward, right? I don't know that that money will always be there from the federal government, and it's competitive, right? So it's not a guarantee. And so I often wonder for institutions who say put together a wonderful proposal that maybe just wasn't competitive that year, are there different avenues that we can pursue, right, to still fund that important work, because it's still work that needs to happen, right? It's been identified from the efforts of whoever put together that grant. So can we think about, are there different funders out there? And I think as now we're in this moment where there is more attention on HSIs, my hope is that there is more philanthropic efforts, right? And we have seen some philanthropic efforts from, what is her name? Thank you, Mackenzie Scott, investing a lot in minority serving institutions, many of those HSIs. And so how do we continue to raise that consciousness for funders about the critical role that HSIs play, right? This is the future of higher education. And so how can we think about leveraging that, and that these alums from our institutions are their future employees, our future civic leaders, right? So it's kind of continuing that work there as well. So I think there's campus level work, but there's still some of that outward facing work that we have to do.
Good evening.
Good evening.
You've shared a lot of great thoughts, ideas, content, really rooted around the concept of servingness as a whole, not necessarily tied to any particular ethnic identity, which I love that. We know that across the CSU system, there's a significant focus on Black student success, right? The Chancellor's Office put out a report last June. What can institutions, Sac State has recently, they're on this journey toward Black serving institution designation. What can our institutions learn from the journey of Hispanic servingness to better equip ourselves to be Black serving, while also considering the pervasiveness of anti-Blackness that exists throughout the world?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question, right? And it's exciting to see that work happening in the CSU, and really to see the leadership of President Wood at Sac State, and really all of the advocacy that it took, right, to even self-identify the Black Serving Institution legislation. And so I think actually here I might flip the coin a little bit. I might say that HSRs are going to have something to learn from these Black serving institutions, because really to get that designation, it really is about that intentionality, right? And as far as I understand, some of the design of that Black serving institution was influenced by some of the HSI work, in the sense of looking at examples of excellence, like Excelencia Seal of Excellence, and using some of those indicators, but also going deeper than that, not just looking at outcomes, but how are we changing structures within the institution? How are we equipping faculty to confront, right, some of that anti-Blackness that's embedded so much in our institutions? And so I'm excited to think here, how can we learn about how BSIs are going to be engaging in this work? And that this is about, I think also here, solidarity work, right? We're not, these are all important conversations, all in service to support our students and to prepare what we need for the success of California moving forward, right? These are not abstract ideas. All of that is going to lead to greater success. Why wouldn't we do it, right? We know there's resistance and there's challenges in that, but I think that it begins to give us, I think for me, it gives me hope, right? That we're now able to talk about these things more up front, because you can't change things when we're not being transparent or naming the problem. So I think that's helped us a bit there too, in terms of being more explicit about what it is that we're talking about. And I think that's like the being more unapologetic about saying these are times, this is an opportunity for us to think about education differently, to really serve the students that we have today. So I'm excited about the work happening.
Thank you for your talk, I really appreciate it. Picking up on that point with Sac State and President Luke, I think one of the things that they're being unapologetic about is, yes, they're trying to get the BSI designation, but also starting a Black Honors Program.
Yes.
And oftentimes when we talk about HSI, I think the conversation is good because we're trying to meet the students where they are, but oftentimes, we're conflating commuter students and first gen, and that's great, but also thinking about the other end as well. And I know you mentioned Excelencia and things of that nature. Can you talk through some models that have a really good approach of, yes, we want to meet students where they are and provide bridge programs and things of that nature, but we're also thinking about the top end as well and making sure that we're, setting the bar really high and celebrating that in those ways. I'm familiar with Sac State. I don't know about a school that does it really well as HSI that we can learn from.
Gosh, that's a great question. So I know that we have like the Seal of Excelencia just came out with their list of institutions that got the seal this year. And so we might turn to look at some of those, but let me think of examples of institutions that come to mind. It's a little hard to think at that level, right? So I might want to come back to this question as I think about something that's happening like really deeply, because to me I want to say, who's changing curriculum? Who's changing policy to think about how we are serving students more directly? And I think we have so much work to do, because one of the things that's coming to mind right now is that there was just a report that came out about the CSU and the UC and how their undocumented student numbers have declined in the last 5 years. So I think about that, I'm like, we might be doing work in one way, but yet we're not doing work in all the ways that we need to be thinking about. Now, I think that, let me come back to you on that. That's a good question. I think though that when I see things like what President Wood is doing with the creation of a Black Honors College, it's really saying, we're not talking about decreasing standards. We're talking about just giving students high expectations with high levels of support, with curriculum that reflects communities and histories that they need to know, right? And I think that that is exciting to think of that. I guess I'll say, if I'm thinking, I don't know that it's a model, but I was really intrigued at the time when I was at Channel Islands that they had created these first-year seminars, and they were really thinking about the goal of institutionalization. Now, that is the goal of many of these Title V grants, meaning once the grant ends, how has the institution kept the programming that they developed if it works for them? And so I think that's why I'm having a hard time, because I don't know that we have many examples of what has stayed afterwards. And so I think that's a question, that's a challenge about institutionalization. I was just at an HSI a few weeks ago, and they were sharing how their Title V grants were ending. And so the programming was ending, but there was no clear sense of what they were doing after. And that's the challenge, right? Of how do you make sure that you keep the work going when you know that it is reducing inequities? And I don't think we have enough examples of that, unfortunately, yet.
And we have time for one more question. Everybody's good.
Hi. That was nerve-wracking. Okay, one more. So I just want to say thank you for sharing how your experience has informed your journey and your practice in higher ed. I found the Photo Voice project to be very inspiring and coming from a space of serving STEM students specifically at the community college level. I'm really excited to incorporate that into my campus and really be informed by our students. And in particular, your one slide with all the photos that indicated structures, my question for you is, considering how frequently students found servingness through structures, what insight would you have for smaller campuses where space is a limitation, and how can we create spaces that advance the solidarity and allyship, but also be culturally conscious and recognize our historically marginalized student populations?
Yeah, that is a great question, right? And I think one thought that I would have first is, like, how do we know where those spaces are that students already feel, right, welcomed or feel affirmed? Where are the spaces when they're not feeling that, right? So I have another colleague who does an activity in her class where she does a mapping where they have the Google map, and they have to put a pin on where on campus do you feel affirmed, where do you not feel affirmed. And I think some activity like that might give us a sense, okay, these are the spaces where students are not being affirmed. Might there be ways for us to build community there a little bit more intentionally? What are the things that they write about, right, that don't make them feel affirmed in those spaces? Or might we think about spaces near those areas where there may be a way for us to build community? So that's one of the things that comes to mind. I think it's like an ongoing process, right? So, well, these spaces exist on our campus. They're still not adequate. There's still more work to do. And so I think that's where, too, students themselves can serve as like those co-creators of ideas to say, sometimes they have creative things that just like, yeah, we've never thought about it in that way. And so I think the more that we can equip students a little bit with resources as well, right? How do we support students to be active contributors in that so that we are elevating them and thinking also within the confines of our structures? Because in some campuses, that's not possible, right? But to create multiple spaces, but how can we create solidarity across spaces? What I've seen, and this is just because I'm more familiar with this on our campus, we have the different identity centers really collaborate with each other and have conversations about how do we support each other. And I think some of that, like advocacy and allyship, begins there, where we have to create structures where folks are not competing for resources, and we need to model that ethos too, right? And how can we think about that? The other thing that somebody had asked earlier today is how do we ensure that students feel welcomed even in these affinity spaces? And what we have seen on our campus with some of these spaces, many different students engage in those spaces because once they walk in there, they find community or vibrancy or spaces to study. And for many students, that's what they're looking for. I also want to mention there's a recent study that came out in the Journal of Hispanics in Higher Ed, and they gathered information from their graduating students at this one HSI, and they mentioned that the library was the space of community. And they were shocked. So there might be spaces that we might just be shocked are actually the spaces that students are engaging in. And then they thought about that. How can we make that space then even more welcoming now that we know that that's a hub? And it was a surprise to them, but they said it somewhat makes sense because students feel affirmed there. They're finding students to study with. And so I think we might be surprised when we just kind of ask students, what are they telling? What can we learn from them? And how can we elevate those spaces where they are already affirmed? And when they're not, where they're not, that's a space that we have to do work and figure that out. I also wanted to come back to your question because I was like, there has to be examples. So I'm going to mention one of the institutions that I just really am excited about with some of the work that they've done in the last 10 years is UC Santa Cruz. Because for their HSI efforts, they've said, this is about racial equity. And everything that we do is centering racial equity. And I think that is powerful framing when we say that is our approach to this work and how can we use this work towards those goals. And so I just wanted to say, I don't want to leave like not thinking there are models out there. That's one of the ones that comes to mind for me. And we see work happening at different campuses. I want to highlight again that Sacramento State project led by Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Van Lier Ferreira is happening at Sac State. So there's a lot of stuff happening at Sac State, right? So that we need to look at what can we learn, what can we all learn from the kinds of things that are happening in different spaces.
All right, if you'll indulge us just a moment, before we conclude, we have a gift for Dr. Cuellar.
We wanted to give her just a small token of our appreciation. Could we give her a round of applause again for her fabulous presentation? All right, well, that concludes our program this evening. We hope that you'll take a moment to come say hi to Dr. Cuellar or ask her your questions personally. But otherwise, keep a lookout for additional programs that we'll be offering throughout the semester, and thank you all for attending tonight.